Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast and YouTube show where I answer questions from SQL Server database administrators or sometimes about SQL Server database administrators. I'm Kendra Little, and here is this week's question. Dear SQL DBA, there's so much to know within SQL. As a beginner DBA, having just 1 to 2 years of experience, I'm not sure what's a good starting point to becoming a great DBA. What would you say I should really take the time to understand? What would take me to the next level? Now, the cool thing about this question is I actually have a second person asking this question. The very same problem is being confronted by another listener who wrote, Dear SQL DBA, I am a junior DBA working in a very large company with very few DBA peers, and there's no one who I can really look up to as a senior DBA. Luckily, production is pretty well tuned, so my workload isn't overwhelming, but without a senior DBA to mentor me and bounce ideas off of, I don't have a good path to master my environment and move up or on to another company. I regularly read community blogs and I get all the online training I can get my hands on, but I'm still worried that my skills fall short. Do you have any suggestions for leveling up without a senior DBA's guidance? Now, it's not just these two folks who are asking me this question. I get this question at conferences, gotten it on webcasts before, I've gotten emails about this. This is a really common problem to say the DBA career isn't really clearly defined. There's no traditional defined path for this that people learn in school. And more, the DBA's job is changing with the advent of cloud technologies and virtualization and all sorts of changes in how IT runs, right? We don't use punch cards anymore. More and more, there isn't a way we're always going to do things. And we frequently don't have a mentor to guide us. And even if we do have a mentor, sometimes it's not clear to them what path we should take. So it's confusing. And I've got good news. There aren't as many choices as it feels like. Yes, there's a ton of stuff that you could learn, but really, what you're at this point where you say, I am a junior DBA or a mid-level DBA and I want to level up my career, you are at a choose your own adventure moment where there are really two paths that you should choose between. And I'm going to argue really strongly for one of these paths today, but really there are two paths, and the choice as to which path you want to take is all up to you. So here's the two paths that lie before you, the two big ways that you can choose to level up your DBA career. The first path, let's call it the path on the left. This is a path where you can build projects at work. You identify what are the projects that I should invest time in that not only are really valuable to my employer by focusing on things that are really critical to them, but also are topics that I really need to know rock solid, and I need to be great at defining processes about these tasks. Because as you level up your career and become a great DBA, a huge component of your job is defining processes for other people to carry out and establishing standards that need to be met by the whole team, even if you're not the only one doing it. And you need to be able to teach these concepts to your team and explain why it's so critical, right? So identifying the really right projects, and the biggest one for database administrators, the number one thing is very much to what is the appropriate amount of data loss that is acceptable for each database, and what is the allowed downtime for each database, and how do I make sure that we have things set up so that we don't lose more data or have more downtime than is allowed for that database. Now, for this path, the path of work projects to level up your career, The pros for this are it's something you can do within your work hours. Now, you may still need to learn to say no to some things at work because there may be a lot of reactionary tickets you get and day-to-day stuff. But the nice thing about the projects that I've talked about are if you outline the importance of this, of making sure that you don't lose too much data or have more downtime than allowable, if you outline this to your boss and say, here's my plan, I want to over time, look at this and make sure that we're really solid at this over the next 6 months. I need this much time each week to carve it out. Here's my proposal for how to make that happen. You are really likely to get a lot of support for that. So this is something that you can do in work hours. Now the cons for this are, it doesn't build all of the skills that you need to level up your DBA career. It doesn't build leadership skills, and it doesn't build communication skills necessarily. You can invest extra effort in kind of making sure that you're working on those as well, but they aren't sort of inherent. It's more of a technical and project management growth, which are important. They just aren't everything. Another con is that it doesn't connect you in the community with people who you can bounce ideas off of, people who can give you insight into things, or people who you can ask questions of in your field. It doesn't fill that gap for you, and you'll kind of persist in sort of a lonelier sphere, which is harder over the long term. Even if, like me, you have introvert tendencies, having those, connections and people to work with is really, really great. So this first path can get you a really good distance throughout your career, working slow and steady. But I am not going to talk about this path for most of today's episode. If you're like, this is really the path for me, I really want detailed steps on how to build things with projects at work, do a Google search for Kendra Little Junior DBA. And you'll find that I wrote a post called What's the Difference Between a Junior and Senior DBA? And that post ends with a checklist about how to level up your career, working on identifying and then executing the right projects at work for you to build on. So I've got a resource for you there, even though I really believe that there is a better path for you and another more exciting alternative to level up your DBA career, and one that is going to be even more rich in opportunity for you. And I totally know this sounds like an infomercial, right? Just there's low pricing on this. It does cost you time. Literally, it's going to cost you time. The path on the right, and what I believe is the better path to level up your DBA career, is to become someone who sometimes, not for your old job, but sometimes teaches other people how to be good DBAs. To start to become a public speaker and an educator in the SQL Server community. And the SQL Server community is a terrific community with new opportunities for beginner speakers. The pros of this are becoming a teacher and speaking to others about database administration is going to build your technical skills, just like working on projects does, because you've got to write a lot of demos, you've got to do a lot of research, you've got to really, there's no way to learn something other than to have to teach it. But in addition, it's also going to build your communication skills. You're going to figure out better ways to explain things. And it's going to build your leadership skills. Because when you teach a session, you are leading the conversation and you are guiding that room in a way that just working on projects that are technical is never going to get you. Public speaking about SQL Server will also connect you with other people in your field. You'll meet with people in your audience. You'll meet with other speakers. You'll find people who work on similar things like you do, and people who work on very different things that are interesting to you as well. And this will end up filling that gap where you say, I don't really have anyone to bounce ideas off of. You're going to have a lot of people to bounce ideas off of, and also who you can ask for help and feedback on a ton of different topics. Now, there are some cons to this path. This is going to require a time commitment, and it's not part of your job because you probably don't already have a job as a community evangelist. Those folks are usually very experienced public speakers. As a junior DBA, this isn't something that you can do as part of your 9 to 5. And making sure that you're not overworking yourself at work and actually keeping your work hours sane so that taking a chunk out of your personal time to do something that isn't related to your family and your friends isn't horribly painful, that is going to be important too. So managing your time is absolutely the hardest part of this. And for some of us, public speaking is terrifying, and it can take a lot of courage to get into this. I do know many of us have overcome that. It is something you can invest in, you can find the courage, you can do it, and I promise you, the more times you do it, the easier it gets. The reason that I really much believe that this is the best path to leveling up your DBA career is I've tried both of these paths, and I was successful at both of them. But in the years of working on more and more projects at work, I found that, my growth as a DBA was sort of slow and steady, which is good. But a lot of my growth in that plugging away on projects ended up being knowledge that was really specific to my job, which, I would work on cool things and solve cool problems, but to really understand how cool they were, you had to have access to a lot of confidential information that I can't just tell everybody, right? So I solved a lot of cool problems, a lot of which I couldn't talk about publicly, which could be a little frustrating at times because I would want to be able to explain the cool stuff I'd done. And I also fell into the trap of just spending too much time at work and working more and more hours on this past the number of hours I should every week and getting burnt out on working all of these projects. When I started working a reasonable number of hours, which by the way, my employer was actually very much in favor of. A lot of employers don't want you to burn out. They want you to have a hobby or another hobby or an extra hobby. When I actually, started balancing things out more, it took some of the stress out of my work life because I had a different sort of mental outlet that wasn't part of work and it made me a more well-rounded person. And that actually helped me out a lot, even though it was a chunk out of my personal time. So you do need to balance that with your family and make sure that you are still, spending the right amount of time with the people who matter to you most. But it is, I think, as a person, very rewarding. And it has a lot of really tangible career rewards. So for me, it not only gave me these new contacts in the SQL Server community who I could bounce ideas off of and learn from, and really just relationships that are extremely valuable, but also speaking gave me a new way of listening. When you're speaking and working with an audience, you will become better and better over time at listening to questions. And at first I was just terrified of questions. At first I was just, how can I avoid any questions? But as you do this, you become better and better at it. And at this point, I actually really enjoy questions because it gives me a way to see how are people thinking about this? What are they struggling with? And it's a really interesting thing to me to be, how can I explain this better? And how can we, bridge this gap and make this information really work for my audience is now one of my favorite things to do. This ability to listen comes in handy in tons of situations. When you have to explain something to your boss's boss at work, the ability to listen to the questions well and get creative about responding to them, having practice at that from public speaking is going to make you so much better in that, and also just make you more confident at explaining something to any audience, whether it's a C-level executive or a kindergarten class. It turns out there's similar things you can do that can make communication more and less effective that you are really going to build your skills at. You'll be able to think on your feet better, and you will have better technical knowledge about the subjects that you are presenting on because you are going to learn those topics super duper well. One thing you really need to be careful of is when you start to pick the right topics to speak on. And I know this because I totally screwed it up. Like, I screwed it up bad, but I screwed it up in a way that's very common and that a lot of people mess up. I had the impression that when I started teaching people, I should teach on an area that kind of wasn't already taken. You know, I should respect what other people were talking about, and I should pick something new or different or unique. And this meant that I started presenting on topics that weren't very useful to me, and there weren't a lot of people who were using them who it was immediately useful to either. And that wasn't really good for any of us, right? That was a lot of time that I invested in learning something really well that just wasn't all that useful. Instead, you should pick something that is very useful for junior DBAs and that is going to be useful for you to know backwards and forwards as you grow in your career. And the number one area around this is making sure that you don't have data loss or downtime, right? That's really super critical for everyone who's a DBA. And even if you don't have time in your schedule every day where you think about it, the DBA is the one who ends up being responsible for that, right? So backups. An amazing topic for you to present on, or restoring backups, right? Did I mention backups? It's a really critical topic. Also, other topics that can work: SQL Server installation and configuration, database settings, anything related to core database maintenance, any common automation needs that people need to learn how to handle. And you could also consider backups as a topic. And you might be like, well, Kendra, there's a lot. I mean, really, like, I can't talk about backups or whatever one of these topics kind of lights you up and that is really kind of an important thing for DBAs to know about. I can't talk about that because, like, there's this an expert speaker X already talks about that, and I am not going to be as good. Just when you find yourself thinking that, and you will, just stop. So here's what to think about. There is room for you in the community next to expert speaker X. Because expert speaker X isn't everywhere at every event all the time. They aren't at every SQL Saturday. They can't be. And they probably don't want to be because they want to be with their family. But also, expert speaker X is great. I love expert speaker X, but I also love hearing from other people too, because there is a lot of room in this community for multiple people to present on the same topics. And I go to different sessions on the same topics. Different presenters all explain different things in different ways, and I learn things at every single session that I go to. As long as when you write your session, when you're doing research, you use multiple sources, and as long as you think about your own experience and you really think about, what did I struggle with this topic? What excites me about this topic? And what do I think is really cool? And what is like the most confusing but something still really important about this? As long as you think about those things, you're explaining this from your perspective. This is your talk, and it is about your experience with the technology and your knowledge of it. It is very different than expert speaker X's talk, right? So there is absolutely room for you in this community, and it is better for all of us in this community if you join the community of speakers as well as the community of learners. There is absolutely room for this for you in both places, and we want you in both places. And if you need any more convincing, if you're like, well, so I hear this sometimes too, but Kendra, I am not qualified to talk about X. Let's think about it this way. Imagine that a year has passed, because time is going to pass no matter what, and you're in a job interview, and maybe it's at your own company, but maybe it's at another company, and it's for a more senior position than you're in now. And the interviewer, it's a technical interview, and they say, we need to make sure that you have the basics down about backups. And they start drilling you with technical questions about backups. Now imagine that you are in that interview as you are right now, and you haven't, presented anything, and you're not used to getting drilled with these questions on a regular basis, and you kind of fumble your way through it, and you're like, well, I think, not sure. Now, imagine instead that you've spent time over that year preparing a presentation on backups, and you've given it at a SQL Server user group and at a SQL Saturday. You've given it twice. And you handled some questions from the audience each time and, got better on your second time. And now you're in that interview, and now you start getting these questions, and you're like, oh, I know how to handle these questions. And the ones that you know the answers to, you just knock right out of the park. And there's one that you're not really sure of, but you're like, well, that's an interesting question. Here's what I know that's related, and here's what I think I could do to figure out the answer to that. Can I follow up with you later? Which is exactly what you've learned to do with audience questions, when answering questions in your presentation. Like, presenting makes you such a better candidate in any interview situation, because you get good at handling interview questions by working with your audience and being brave enough to kind of confront that in the speaker room. The interview room becomes much less of a big deal, trust me. Because there is a much smaller audience in the interview room. Usually, at most in an interview room, you've got 3 or 4 people. At a user group, you're usually going to have, 8, 10 people plus. Some are larger, depending on where you are. So where should you start speaking? I hope I've made you say, hey, maybe I should try this out. There's a lot of great places in the SQL Server community to try this out. SQL Server user groups are part of the Professional Association of SQL Server. And if you search on the internet for SQL Server user group, you'll get to the PASS website, and you'll find there are user groups all around the world. And you can find your local group, figure out where they are, and start attending and talk to the person who organizes it and say, I would like to start out speaking. What level, what length session do you recommend for people who are starting? Because you want to know, a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, maybe we'll have 2 speakers on one night, but they might want you to give a longer session too, and you can figure out what works for that group. If you have a preference, you can start with a shorter session. I will tell you that I personally think 5-minute sessions are incredibly hard with that short time limit. I think lightning talks are among the hardest. So give yourself at least 10 or 15 minutes, so that you're not trying to fit everything into like an exact infomercial length, because landing those on time is really hard. Another option is SQL Saturdays. If you go to SQLSaturday.com, these events are held around the world, and you can start speaking at them as well. Most people recommend that folks start with a user group, because it tends to be a smaller, more casual audience. Check out your local user group and see how comfy you are. You might live near a really large user group. There are some of them that actually get like 100 people sometimes. Or like me, when I first started, my local user group I was in Seattle, and my local user group was in the building where they wrote SQL Server, and the speakers each month were the people who make SQL Server and literally the people who wrote the book on SQL Server. And that, I was like, this is not like a beginner forum. So I looked at the SQL Saturday website, and I looked at cheap flights, and I said, I think Iowa is probably a really lovely place, in part because I don't know anyone in Iowa, and there's a cheap plane ticket around the time of this SQL Saturday. So I outlined, I wrote an abstract, and I did an outline, and I looked in the mirror, and I said, can you really write this presentation? And I looked at my outline, and I said, I can. And I submitted it, and they accepted me. Bless their hearts. Actually, I really thank you for accepting me. I gave my talk, and the earth didn't swallow me up, and angels didn't sing either. It was somewhere in between. I made some mistakes. People asked great questions. I learned something. A couple other people learned something. And at the end, I said, I think this could be really good for me. And it was hard, but I want to do this again because I think this could really be a great part of my life and of my career. And so I kept speaking and I kept getting better. So I started at a SQL Saturday. User groups are great. If you're not afraid of a webcam, there are virtual opportunities to start as well. You will naturally bring what you learned from speaking back into your workplace. You'll learn things from your own sessions and from other people's sessions that say, oh, there's a better way we could do this. And you'll tell your boss where you learned it. And that's important. Always mention, this speaking isn't really part of your job as a DBA most of the time, but it is a related activity. And as these events help you do things better, you always want to make sure your boss knows that it helps you, because that really encourages them to keep supporting you and to find some budget to send you to more and more events, which you can speak at and learn at. Sometimes with some events, if you are a speaker there, sometimes they can have some funds for you to at least get into the conference for free, but not all events pay for all of your costs as a speaker. So having workplace support is still really, really super useful. So I really hope that today, in talking about these different paths to level up your DBA career, I hope that I have inspired some of you and made you think, maybe I could, because you can. You totally can become a person who not only likes to work with SQL Server and enjoys it and wants to make it your profession, but you can become someone who helps other people learn how to be better with SQL Server and how to be better database administrators too. Thanks for joining me today on the Dear SQL DBA podcast. I'll see you again next week.